My name is Dana Whitcomb. I'm 44 years old and I work as a senior claims investigator in the Special Investigations Unit of a regional insurance company outside Portland, Oregon, which is a formal way of saying that fraud is, professionally, the thing I notice before anyone else in the room notices it. On the evening of April 11th, at my father's 78th birthday dinner, my stepmother Renata slid a single sheet of paper across the white tablecloth toward me between the bread basket and my untouched glass of wine, and asked me, in the same pleasant tone she'd used to ask someone to pass the salt, whether I'd mind just initialing here to make things simple for everyone later. I want to describe that piece of paper carefully because I've spent a career reading documents that were built to look more innocent than they actually were, and I recognized what this one was doing within about 4 seconds of glancing at it. It was titled in a plain 12-point font, Family Fairness Understanding, and it stated in 3 short paragraphs that in recognition of my strong independent financial position and my siblings' greater present need, I agreed to voluntarily accept a reduced share of any future inheritance from our father's estate, with the specific balance to be determined later in the spirit of family harmony. There was a line at the bottom for my signature. There was no line for grants, there was no line for pages. There was, notably, no line for my father's either, though it was his estate the document presumed to redirect. I looked up from the page, first at Renata, who held my gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who has rehearsed this moment more than once in a mirror, and then at my brother Grant, 48 years old, sitting across the table in a blazer that cost more than my last 4 car payments combined, who suddenly found something fascinating in the bottom of his water glass. My sister Paige, 40 years old, 3 seats down, was watching me with an expression I'd seen on her face since we were children, the specific look of someone hoping very hard that I would simply do the easy thing so nobody had to have the hard conversation. My father, Walter Whitcomb, sat at the head of the table in the chair he'd occupied at every family dinner for as long as I could remember, 78 years old. Founder of 6 Whitcomb hardware and supply stores across the Willamette Valley, a man who built a business out of a single rented storefront in 1974 through nothing but stubbornness and an almost pathological attention to detail. He was not looking at the document at all. He was looking, instead, at his water glass, turning it slowly on the tablecloth, the particular unfocused way he'd started looking at things over the past 18 months that none of us had yet found a comfortable word for out loud. I want to be honest about the exact feeling that moved through me in that moment because I think it matters more than the document itself. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something closer to the specific, cold clarity I get at work when a claim that looked ordinary on the surface reveals, on a second read, the outline of something deliberately built. I had reviewed thousands of documents constructed to look like a formality when they were actually a maneuver. I had simply never expected to be handed one over birthday cake by my own family. "I'm not going to initial this tonight, Renata," I said, keeping my voice at the same level I use when I tell a claimant their file has been flagged for review, not cold, just even. "I'm not going to initial it at all, actually, until I understand what it's actually asking me to agree to and who asked you to draft it." "Nobody asked me to draft anything, Dana," Renata said, and I watched her arrange her face into something between hurt and patience, an expression I'd cataloged from her many times over the 9 years she'd been married to my father. "I just think it's healthier if we're all honest with each other now, rather than letting money turn into a fight later after your father's gone. You've always been the practical one. I assumed you'd appreciate someone else being practical for once." Grant finally looked up from his water glass. "Nobody's trying to cut you out of anything, Dana. It's literally the opposite. We're trying to be fair. You and Marcus are doing fine. Paige just went through a divorce. I've got the restaurant situation. It just makes sense that whatever Dad leaves gets split according to who actually needs it, instead of splitting it 3 even ways just because that's how it's always technically been on paper." I sat with that sentence for a moment, the specific reasonableness of it, the way it managed to sound almost generous while asking me to sign away something none of us had ever actually seen written down anywhere, on the word of people who had never once in 9 years shown me a single figure. I looked at my father again. He had picked his water glass back up, and he was smiling faintly at something across the room that none of the rest of us could see. I folded the piece of paper in half, then in half again, and put it in my jacket pocket rather than handing it back. "I'll think about it," I said, which was not true, and which I said only because I had learned over 4 decades in this family that the fastest way to end a conversation you're not ready to finish is to sound like you might eventually agree with it. I didn't think about it that night, not really. What I thought about, driving home with Marcus in the passenger seat asking, gently, whether I wanted to talk about what had just happened at the table, was a much smaller, stranger detail. The paper had been printed on our father's own stationery, the Whitcomb hardware and supply letterhead he'd used for internal memos since the 80s. The kind he kept in a specific drawer in his home office that, as far as I knew, only he and I had a key to. I want you to remember that detail because it's the first thread of something I wouldn't understand the full shape of for another 4 months, and because it's the exact moment this story actually starts, whatever the calendar might tell you about when my father turned 78. If you're new to this channel, welcome. And if you've ever been handed a piece of paper by your own family that asked you to sign away something you never even got to see, I think you already know exactly what kind of evening that dinner table actually was. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if you're the kind of person who documents instead of shouts, stay with me, because this is a long story and every part of it matters. I don't think this is really a story about money, whatever the title might suggest. I never once wanted to see my brother or my sister publicly humiliated or cut off entirely for its own sake. What I wanted, for longer than I let myself admit, was simply to understand why the people who'd spent 40 years telling me I was the strong one seemed to believe that strength was a reason to give me less, rather than a reason to trust me with more. That's the story I actually want to tell you tonight. Let me take you back to 1996, the year my mother, Joanne Whitcomb, was diagnosed with the ovarian cancer that would take her 4 years later. When I was 14 years old, Grant was 18, and Paige was 10. I want to describe our family before that diagnosis a little, because I think it's the only honest way to explain the shape of everything that came after it. We grew up in a modest split-level house in Salem, 20 minutes from the first Whitcomb hardware store, in a family where my father worked 6 days a week building a business from nothing and my mother ran the house with the kind of quiet, exacting competence that made everything look easier than it actually was. Grant was the oldest, the one my father took to the store on weekends, the one who got handed the keys to the loading dock at 16 and told, more than once at family dinners, that the whole operation would be his someday. Paige was the youngest, born 9 years after me, arriving late enough into my parents' marriage that she got raised, in practice, by a family that had already softened considerably from the version that raised me. I was the middle child, and I want to give you 3 specific memories from those years because they explain the role I settled into long before my mother ever got sick, and that role would end up mattering enormously later. The first, I was 9 years old and my mother was recovering from a minor surgery, a gallbladder removal, nothing dramatic. And I remember standing in the kitchen making dinner for Grant and Paige off a recipe card I could barely read, because my father was at the store until close and someone needed to feed 2 younger children while our mother rested upstairs. I remember feeling, standing at that stove, less burdened than I expected to feel, and more like I'd been handed a job I was apparently good at. Nobody asked me if I wanted the job. I simply noticed that week that I was the one who did it, and that noticing settled into something closer to identity faster than I think anyone in my family realized at the time. The second, I was 12, and Grant, 16 and freshly licensed, backed my father's delivery truck into a support post at the second Whitcomb store, causing about $4,000 in damage. I remember sitting at the dinner table that night, watching my father's face as Grant explained it, not lying exactly, but softening every detail in a way that made the accident sound almost inevitable rather than the result of him reversing while checking his phone. My father's side said something about how boys make mistakes, and the $4,000 simply became a line item in the store's insurance claim, never once mentioned again at a family dinner. I remember thinking, even at 12, that I understood something about how consequences worked in our house that I couldn't yet have put into words. The third, I was 13 the year before the diagnosis, and I brought home a report card with 5 A's and 1 B+ in algebra. My father looked at it for a long moment and said, "Good, steady as always, Dana. I never worry about you." I remember how much I wanted in that specific moment for him to worry about me a little, not because I wanted to cause him worry, but because I was starting to understand even then that "I never worry about you" was quietly becoming the family's shorthand for "I don't need to pay close attention to you." and that Grant and Paige, in their different ways, got a great deal of attention precisely because they gave my parents reasons to worry. When my mother got sick, the pattern that had already been forming simply accelerated. I was 14, and over the next 4 years, while my father split his time between the store and my mother's oncology appointments, I became, without any formal announcement, the person who managed the house. I did the grocery shopping by 16. I helped Paige, then 10, with her homework most nights. I learned to read my mother's medication schedule better than the home health aide did because I was the one actually there to notice when something looked off. I want to describe one particular evening from that period because I think it's the clearest single memory I have of how the role solidified. I was 17, a few months before my mother died, and I'd driven her to a late chemotherapy appointment because my father was handling an emergency at the store, a burst pipe, I remember, on a Tuesday. Sitting in the infusion center waiting room, my mother, thin and tired in the particular way chemo makes a person tired, took my hand and said, "I don't worry about what happens to this family when I'm gone, Dana, because I know you'll hold it together." I remember how much I wanted that to feel like a compliment. And how, underneath the wanting, some smaller, more honest part of me already understood it as something closer to an assignment, one I hadn't applied for and one nobody had ever offered to Grant or Paige instead. My mother died in March of 2000, 4 days before my 18th birthday. I want to be honest that I don't remember the funeral itself in much detail. What I remember clearly is the week after, when my father, hollowed out in a way I'd never seen him before or since, sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "I need you to help me hold things together for a while, Dana. Grant's got the store now mostly, and Paige is too young. I need you." I said yes, of course, the way I'd said yes to every version of that request since I was 9 years old, making dinner off a recipe card. I didn't yet understand that for a while would end up meaning in practice for the rest of my adult life. I want to add something about Grant and Paige during those years too, because I don't think it's fair to paint either of them as simply villains from childhood, even knowing everything I know now. Grant, at 22 when our mother died, threw himself into the business in his own genuine way, working long hours at the store even as his personal life stayed chaotic. A string of jobs before hardware finally stuck, 2 broken engagements in his 20s, a restlessness I think was its own kind of grief he never quite learned to name. Paige, only 14 when our mother died, spent her teenage years being quietly, thoroughly protected by both my father and me in a way that I think, looking back, may have done her fewer favors than any of us intended at the time. Neither of them asked to be raised the way they were raised. Neither, honestly, did I. By 2005, my father had remarried, a brief, unremarkable second marriage to a woman named Carol that lasted barely 2 years and ended amicably enough that it barely registers in this story at all, except as the thing that happened before Renata. I was 23 that year, working my first real job as a claims adjuster trainee, already showing the specific analytical instincts that would eventually define my whole career. And already, without quite realizing it, the person my father called first whenever anything in the family needed managing: a lease renewal at the 4th store, a dispute with a supplier, eventually later his own medical appointments. I met Marcus in 2007, married him in 2009, and had our daughter Sophie in 2011. I want to note, because it matters later, that my own household, built entirely separately from my father's business, was by every reasonable measure doing well by the time the story really begins. Not wealthy, not by the standard my father's hardware empire eventually reached, but stable, secure, the product of 2 steady incomes and 15 years of careful, unglamorous saving. I mention that only because it's the exact fact my family would later use, repeatedly, as the reason I didn't need anything at all. Renata entered the picture in 2015 when my father was 67 and I was 33. She was 59 at the time, recently divorced, working in the front office of one of my father's supplier companies when they met. I want to be fair to her, at least at the start of this story, because I don't think the earliest version of her marriage to my father was calculated in the way it would later come to look. She was, by most accounts, genuinely good to him in those first years, attentive, warm, present in a way that filled a specific loneliness he carried since my mother died. I liked her honestly for at least the first 2 or 3 years. I want that on the record because I think it makes what happened later harder to explain away as simple, obvious villainy, and I've come to believe that's actually the more honest, more useful version of this story to tell. That's the shape of my family going into the years that matter most here. A father who built something significant out of nothing and never quite learned to talk about feelings directly. An older brother whose restlessness got indulged rather than examined. A younger sister protected past the point protection actually served her. A stepmother who arrived warm and would slowly. Over years, learn exactly how much could be extracted from a family that had never once organized itself around fairness in the first place. And me, in the middle of all of it, 33 years old and already without a single conversation about it, the person everyone assumed would simply keep holding things together indefinitely because I always had. I didn't understand yet, standing at my father's 67th birthday dinner in 2015 watching him introduce Renata to the extended family for the first time. How directly that dynamic, the reliable one who never needs worrying about, would end up being used nearly a decade later to justify a document sliding across a birthday tablecloth asking me to sign away a share of something I didn't even know yet, that I already legally owned in full. I want to add one more piece of context before I walk through the years themselves, because I think it explains something about why this pattern was able to run as long as it did without me naming it clearly, even to myself. I have a coworker, Renee. I'll tell you more about her later because she matters more to this story than a passing mention, who once told me, years before any of this reached its breaking point, that the hardest fraud patterns to catch are never the dramatic ones. They're the ones built entirely out of individually defensible small decisions, none of which would raise a flag on their own, that only become visible once you lay 18 months of transaction history end to end on a single spreadsheet. I remember her saying that to me at work, entirely unrelated to my family. And I remember even then, some small, uncomfortable part of me recognizing the shape of something closer to home than either of us realized at the time. That's exactly the machinery of what happened in my own family, and I want to name it here early because I think it's the single most important structural fact in this whole story. No individual year taken alone looked like betrayal. A restaurant investment here, a custody attorney there. A quiet redistribution of household labor that nobody ever formally assigned to me, that I simply absorbed because I'd always been the one who absorbed things. It's only when you lay 9 years of it end to end, against a father's own eventual written explanation of what he'd actually intended the whole time, that the real shape of it becomes impossible to miss. Let me walk you through the years that actually built toward that April dinner, because I think the specific incidents matter more than any general description of family dysfunction ever could. Year 1, 2016. Grant, then 39, came to my father with a business proposal, a partnership stake in a farm-to-table restaurant a college friend was opening in Bend, Oregon. He needed $40,000 to buy in. My father, who had spent his entire career distrustful of restaurants, specifically worst margins in retail, worse than hardware even, he used to say, agreed anyway, framing it as a loan with a simple handshake repayment plan of $1,000 a month starting the following year. I remember finding out about the loan almost by accident, helping my father organize his home office files that same December, coming across a single handwritten note in his desk drawer. Grant, $40,000 restaurant Jan repay start. I asked him about it directly and he waved a hand. It's an investment in your brother finally settling into something, Dana. Don't make it bigger than it is. I let it go, the way I'd learned to let most things involving Grant go, telling myself privately that $40,000 was a small fraction of what the business was worth, and that a father helping his son start something was, on its own, a perfectly ordinary thing. The restaurant closed 11 months later. The $1,000 monthly payments never started. Year 2, 2017. Paige, then 33, going through the early stages of her divorce from her first husband, came to my father needing $18,500 for a retainer with a specialized custody attorney. My father wrote the check within a week, and I remember him telling me about it afterward, not defensively, just factually, the way he told me most things about the store's finances by then. She needs it more than anyone needs anything right now, Dana, you understand that. I did understand it. Genuinely, Paige's ex-husband had a history that made the custody fight legitimately urgent, and I never once resented the money going to her specifically. What I noticed, quietly filing it away the way I'd started filing away most things by then, was that nobody in the family ever used the word loan when the money went to Paige the way they'd at least gestured toward that word with Grant. It was simply help, freely given, no repayment plan attached at all, not even the fictional kind. I want to pause here for a warmer memory, because these years weren't only ledger entries. That same autumn of 2017, my father closed the flagship store early on a Tuesday, something he almost never did, and drove out to watch Sophie, then 6, in her first dance recital. I remember him sitting in the third row in his work boots, still smelling faintly of the store, clapping louder than anyone else in the auditorium when she wobbled through her routine. Afterward, he told her with total sincerity that she'd been the steadiest one up there, and I remember catching Marcus's eye across the row, both of us recognizing the specific phrase and both of us glad in that moment that it had landed on a 6-year-old simply as a compliment, uncomplicated by anything else it might one day come to mean. If you've ever kept your own quiet running total of who gave what to whom in your family, and never quite found the moment to say it out loud, I'd like to hear about it in the comments when we get to the end of this one. I read every single one, and this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. For now, let's keep going, because the next few years are where the pattern stopped being something I could reasonably explain away. Interlude 2017. Before year 3, I want to note something about Renata's own early financial habits in the marriage, because it matters to the fuller shape of this story. That spring, I noticed, helping my father with a tax document, that Renata had begun opening several joint accounts with him, a shared checking account, a joint credit card, arrangements that were, on their own, entirely ordinary for a remarried couple. What struck me, looking closer, was the pattern of the credit card statements, modest but frequent purchases for her adult children, framed in conversation whenever it came up at all, as just helping out a little the way any family does. I didn't raise it with my father directly that year. I remember thinking at the time that it wasn't really my business how he chose to be generous with his own new wife, and that scrutinizing her spending too closely would have made me exactly the kind of suspicious, controlling daughter I'd always been careful not to become. I understand now that the distinction I was drawing then between healthy boundaries and willful blindness wasn't nearly as clear as I believed it to be at the time. Year 3, 2018. This was the year I started managing my father's household finances directly, not because anyone formally asked me to, but because Renata, going through his bill-paying folder one afternoon while I was visiting, mentioned that she found all the numbers stuff overwhelming, and my father, without much discussion, simply handed the task to me instead. I began that year reconciling his personal accounts monthly, tracking the store's distributions to him, and noticing for the first time with real clarity the pattern that had been building since 2016, Grant's $40,000 still unpaid. Paige's $18,500 never framed as a loan at all. And my own contribution to the family's financial life, dozens of unpaid hours every month, now formalized into an actual bookkeeping role, going entirely unmentioned in any conversation about what any of us had received from our father. I want to describe the specific moment I noticed the imbalance clearly enough to name it, because I think it matters. I was sitting at my father's kitchen table that October, reconciling his checking account against 6 months of statements, when I found a third disbursement I hadn't known about. $11,000 to Renata's adult son from her first marriage, a man named Kyle I'd met perhaps 4 times total for what the memo line simply described as truck. I asked my father about it that same afternoon. He looked briefly uncomfortable, then said, "Renata asked Dana, he's family now too in his way, it's not a big deal." I remember writing the figure down in my own private notebook, the one I'd started keeping that year, initially just for my own bookkeeping clarity, though I understand now it had already quietly become something closer to a record. Year 4, 2019. My father's first real health scare arrived that spring, a cardiac episode serious enough to require a stent, though not serious enough at the time to change how anyone in the family talked about his long-term health. I flew back from a work conference the day it happened, sat with him through the procedure, and spent the following 2 weeks coordinating his follow-up care, his medication schedule, and a temporary reduction in his hours at the store, almost entirely alone. Grant visited twice during that stretch, each time for under an hour. Paige called most days, which I don't discount. Her calls genuinely mattered to my father's spirits during a frightening stretch, but the actual logistics, the pharmacy runs, the cardiologist appointments, the conversations with the store's operations manager about covering my father's absence, fell to me by default, the way they always had. I want to describe one particular night from that hospital stay in more detail, because it's the clearest memory I have of what those 2 weeks actually demanded. My father woke at 2:40 in the morning, disoriented from the anesthesia still working out of his system, convinced briefly that he was late opening the flagship store. I was the one there in the recliner beside his bed, the one who talked him calmly back to where he actually was, the way I'd once talked Sophie down from nightmares as a toddler. I called Grant the next morning to let him know how the night had gone. He said, "God, that sounds rough, Dana. Let me know if you need anything," and then didn't call again for 4 days. I remember one specific conversation with Renata that April, the two of us sitting in the hospital cafeteria while my father slept upstairs. "You're so good at all this, Dana," she said, and I remember at the time taking it as a genuine compliment rather than the quiet redistribution of labor it actually was. "I don't know what any of us would do without you handling it." I said something modest in response, the way I always did, and didn't yet notice that handling it had become, functionally, my full-time unpaid second job, running parallel to my actual career, with no conversation ever held about what that labor might eventually be worth to anyone, including me. It was also that year, sitting with my father during a quiet stretch of his hospital recovery, that he said something I wrote down in my notebook that same night word for word because it struck me as unusually direct for him. "You know, Dana, your brother and sister need things from me. You've never once needed anything. I want you to know I see the difference, even if I don't always say it." I remember how much that sentence meant to me at the time. The first real acknowledgement in 19 years since my mother died that my father actually saw the specific shape of what I'd been carrying. I did not yet understand how differently that same sentence would eventually get used against me. I want to pause here and give you one of the warmer memories from this same period, because I don't want the story to read as pure, unrelenting grievance, and because it wasn't. That same year, my daughter Sophie, then 8 years old, started spending Saturday mornings at the flagship Whitcomb hardware store with my father, learning to identify tools by name, sorting screws into bins by size while he told her stories about building the first store from an empty lot in 1974. I remember picking her up one Saturday and watching her explain with total 8-year-old confidence the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver to a genuinely bemused customer, my father standing behind the counter beaming in a way I hadn't seen from him since before my mother got sick. Whatever else was quietly accumulating in my private notebook during those years, that particular Saturday ritual stayed, for both of them, uncomplicated and real. Year 5, 2020. Grant's second business venture arrived that year, a specialty tool import business he pitched to my father as learning from the restaurant mistake, requiring an initial investment of $22,000. My father, I want to be honest, hesitated this time longer than he had with the restaurant and asked me directly, sitting in his office that February, what I thought. I told him the truth, that Grant's business plan showed the same pattern I'd flagged in the restaurant pitch 4 years earlier. Optimistic revenue projections with no real accounting for the specific risks of the tool import market, a market I happen to understand reasonably well given my own father's 40-year career in hardware retail. My father listened to the whole analysis carefully, thanked me for it genuinely, and then funded the business anyway 3 weeks later at a slightly reduced figure of $18,000. When I asked him gently why, he said something that I've turned over many times since. "I know you're right about the numbers, Dana. But your brother needs to believe someone still trusts him with something, or I'm worried what happens to him without that. I don't worry about you that way, I never have." I remember driving home that evening turning that sentence over, understanding for the first time with real clarity that being trusted with the truth and being trusted with the money had quietly become two entirely different things in my father's mind, and that I had somehow ended up in the category that only ever received the first one. The tool import business folded within 14 months, the $18,000 gone the way the restaurant investment had gone before it, not through any dramatic failure, just the slow, ordinary attrition of a venture that had never had solid footing to begin with. I want to note the running total here because I kept it updated in my notebook and it matters later. By the end of 2020, Grant had received $58,000 in what my father's own records, when I eventually reviewed them properly, described inconsistently as loans. Investments, and in one case simply help. Paige had received, across several smaller disbursements beyond the initial $18,500 for her divorce, closer to $31,000 total, all of it framed every single time as need rather than debt. I had received, across 5 years of unpaid bookkeeping, medical coordination, and household management, exactly nothing, and had never once in 5 years asked for anything either. A fact I told myself at the time made me the responsible one, and which I understand now had simply made me the invisible one instead. I want to include one more thing here, outside the year-by-year accounting, because I think it matters to understanding how long this pattern was allowed to run unexamined. Marcus, my husband, had been quietly flagging pieces of it to me for years before I let myself really hear him. I remember one conversation specifically, from the fall of 2020. The two of us doing dishes after a family dinner where Grant's tool import pitch had dominated most of the evening's conversation. "Dana," Marcus said, drying a plate slowly, "I've watched your dad fund 2 failed businesses for your brother in 4 years, and I've watched you organize his entire medical care for free, and I've never once heard anyone at that table ask what you might need. Doesn't that seem strange to you?" I remember deflecting that night the way I deflected most versions of this conversation for years. "It's not about needing anything, Marcus. I don't need the money, we're fine." He didn't push it further that evening, but I remember him saying quietly, almost to himself as he put the last dish away, "I know you don't need it." I just think there's a difference between not needing something and never once being offered it, and I don't think your family's ever actually tested which one this is. I didn't have an answer for that at the time. I filed it, the way I filed most hard truths in those years, in the same growing folder of things I wasn't ready to examine closely yet. Year 6, 2021. This was the year the family's financial conversations started happening more and more often without me in the room, a shift I noticed slowly. The way you notice a draft in a house before you ever find the actual gap in the window frame. Renata began hosting what she called family check-ins. Dinners at my father's house that I'd sometimes only hear about afterward from Paige, in a tone that suggested she assumed I'd already known. I remember asking my father about one such dinner directly that September and watching him look mildly confused by the question, as though it hadn't occurred to him that my absence from a conversation about the family's finances was anything other than ordinary scheduling. That same year, I quietly resolved a $5,000 billing dispute with one of the store's longtime suppliers. A mistake that had gone unnoticed for months because my father by then was reviewing invoices less carefully than he once had. I handled it entirely on my own time, over 3 phone calls spread across a single week, and mentioned it to my father only after it was fully resolved, the way I mentioned most things by then, as a completed fact rather than a request for acknowledgement. He thanked me warmly enough, and the conversation moved on within minutes to a question about Grant's upcoming trip to look at restaurant equipment for a 4th potential venture he was already quietly considering. I remember noting, driving home that evening, how quickly a genuine save on my part became background noise, while even a hypothetical new expense for Grant held the room's attention for the better part of 20 minutes. It was also the year I first heard the specific phrase that would come to define the next 3 years of this story. At a Sunday lunch that October, Paige, discussing her ongoing struggles to find stable childcare after the divorce, said, almost offhandedly, "It's different for you, Dana. You and Marcus figured all that out years ago. You don't really need to worry about money the way the rest of us do." I remember the specific quality of that sentence, not cruel, not even entirely inaccurate on its own narrow terms, but carrying underneath it an assumption I hadn't consented to and had never actually confirmed, that my household stability was simply a fact of nature. Unrelated to 15 years of careful, deliberate saving, rather than the direct product of choices Marcus and I had made specifically because neither of us had ever once been handed $40,000 to soften a bad decision. I didn't correct her that afternoon. I want to be honest about why. Correcting her would have required explaining out loud exactly how much unpaid labor and exactly how little financial help I'd received compared to both of my siblings. And some part of me even then worried that saying it plainly would sound like keeping score in a way that wasn't becoming of the strong one. I understand now that the worry itself was the trap, and that I'd been walking into it quietly for over a decade. Year 7, 2022. My father's cognitive changes became harder to explain away that year. Small things at first, repeating a story twice within the same conversation, forgetting whether he'd already called the pharmacy about a refill once memorably, unable to recall the name of the accountant he'd worked with for over 20 years. I raised it gently with Renata that spring, suggesting we get him evaluated properly rather than simply working around the gaps. She waved it off initially. He's 75, Dana. Everyone gets a little forgetful, though by August, even she couldn't fully explain away an incident where he'd driven to the flagship store on a Sunday, forgetting it was closed, and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes before a passing employee happened to notice him and called Renata. I want to describe the specific texture of that year because it's when the caregiving labor genuinely intensified in ways that went well beyond bookkeeping. I started driving to my father's house most weekends that fall, checking on him directly rather than trusting second-hand reports, coordinating an initial neurological evaluation that confirmed what none of us had wanted to say plainly yet. Mild cognitive impairment, not yet dementia by clinical definition, but a trajectory the neurologist described carefully as one to monitor closely. It was also the year I became, formally, my father's healthcare power of attorney and successor trustee on his revocable living trust, a decision my father made himself in a meeting with his longtime attorney Harlan Voss that I attended at my father's specific request. I remember Harlan explaining the documents to both of us that afternoon, methodically, the way a good attorney does, and my father nodding along, occasionally adding a comment that made clear he understood exactly what he was signing. I remember him saying near the end of that meeting, "Dana's the one who actually shows up, Harlan. That's not a small thing, write it the way I've told you." Harlan nodded, made a note, and I didn't think much of the specific phrase at the time. I was focused that day on the healthcare directive itself, on making sure I understood his wishes clearly enough to honor them if the time ever came. I want to describe one specific afternoon from that fall in more detail, because it's the clearest single memory I have of what the caregiving actually looked like in practice, beyond the formal titles. My father had missed 2 consecutive doses of his blood thinner, something I only caught because I'd started without any real conversation about it, calling him most evenings at 7 to walk through his pill organizer together over the phone. When I asked Renata, gently, whether she could help make sure the organizer stayed current on the days I wasn't able to call, she said, "Dana, I really think you're overcomplicating this. He's a grown man. I'm not going to hover over him like he's a child." I didn't argue the point. I simply started driving out on Wednesdays as well as weekends, refilling the organizer myself, task that took perhaps 15 minutes and that nobody else in the family ever once offered to share. I want to be honest that I never once asked to see the trust or the will itself that day, or in the 2 years that followed. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me still believed, even 7 years into managing his finances and 3 years into managing his cardiac care, that asking to see the actual estate documents would look like exactly the kind of self-interested behavior I'd spent my whole life trying not to be associated with in this family. I signed the healthcare power of attorney. I accepted the role of successor trustee, and I drove home that afternoon without a single question about what, if anything, any of it actually meant for what I would eventually inherit, because inheritance as a topic had simply never once been something I let myself think about directly. Year 8, 2023. This is the year the pattern I'd been quietly tracking for 7 years finally accelerated into something impossible to keep filing away as ordinary family dysfunction. In March, Grant approached my father with a third venture, a hardware consulting business, ostensibly leveraging decades of insider knowledge of the industry, requiring an initial investment of $31,000 for licensing, marketing, and office setup. I was present for this conversation for the first time in years, specifically because my father had asked me, by then leaning on me more heavily for financial judgment, even as his own capacity to evaluate these requests independently was visibly declining. I laid out the numbers plainly that afternoon, the way I would for any claim file at work. 2 prior ventures funded at a combined total of $58,000, both failed within roughly a year, a combined repayment total across both of exactly $0. Grant, sitting across the table, did not dispute a single figure. What he said instead was, "Dana, I know how this looks on paper, but family isn't supposed to work like a spreadsheet. Dad's helped both of us plenty over the years. I'm not asking for anything you and Marcus haven't already had for free just because you two got lucky with timing. I remember that sentence specifically because it was the first time anyone in my family had directly, explicitly reframed my own household stability built on nothing but 2 ordinary incomes and 15 years of deliberate saving as luck, equivalent in some vague moral sense to $58,000 in unrepaid loans. I didn't argue the point that day. I simply watched my father, visibly torn, ultimately agree to fund the consulting business at a reduced figure of $20,000. And I wrote the number down in my notebook that evening, running total for Grant now at $78,000, alongside a small, private note to myself that I didn't examine too closely at the time. Nobody in this family has ever once called what I do help. By June of that same year, Paige's situation had shifted too. Her ex-husband had fallen behind on child support, and she came to my father needing $11,000 to cover a gap in her mortgage while the arrears made their way through the courts. My father funded it within days, as he always had for Paige, no discussion of repayment at all. I don't begrudge Paige that money even now. Her situation was genuinely difficult, and I've never once believed she manipulated it. What I noticed, updating my notebook that same week, was the widening total. Grant at $78,000, Paige now at roughly $42,000 across the years, and my own contribution, by then including not just bookkeeping and medical coordination but active management of 2 of the 6 Whitcomb hardware store leases my father could no longer track reliably himself, still standing at exactly $0 received, 7 years running. There was one more incident that year worth including, small on its own but part of the widening pattern. In April, I discovered reconciling the household accounts, a second disbursement to Renata's son Kyle, $6,000 memo line reading simply moving help, sent the same month Kyle relocated to Arizona for a new job. When I mentioned it to my father carefully, he looked genuinely uncertain for a moment, the specific uncertainty that had started by then to worry me more than any single dollar figure. "Did I approve that?" he asked. I told him the transfer had gone out under his signature, dated 3 weeks earlier. He was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I don't remember signing that, Dana." I really don't. I want to be honest that this was the first time a financial discrepancy in this family frightened me for reasons that had nothing to do with fairness at all, and everything to do with how clearly it confirmed something about his memory that none of us had yet said plainly out loud to each other. I want to give you one more warm memory from this same difficult year because I think it matters. That August, my father, on one of his better days, sat with Sophie, then 12, at his kitchen table and taught her how to balance the flagship store's petty cash drawer, a small ritual he'd once taught me the same way at roughly the same age. I remember standing in the doorway watching them, my father's hands steadier than they'd been in months, explaining the process with the same patient thoroughness I remembered from my own childhood, and thinking, watching Sophie count out the coins with total seriousness, that whatever else this family had gotten wrong, something real and good was still passing between the generations, quietly underneath everything else. It was also that August, at a smaller family dinner, that Renata first raised, directly, the idea that would eventually become the document she'd slide across the tablecloth 8 months later. "I just think, going forward," she said, cutting into her dinner without quite looking up, "that when the time comes, whatever your father leaves behind should really go where it's needed most." Grant's had a hard run of it business-wise. Paige has the kids to think about. You and Marcus are so settled, Dana. I'd hate to see this family fight over money that would honestly mean more to your brother and sister than it would to you. I remember exactly how I responded because I've thought about it many times since. I said nothing at all. I simply nodded, the specific practiced nod I'd been giving this family for over 2 decades, the one that meant, in the language we'd all silently agreed to speak, "I hear you, and I am not going to make this uncomfortable by disagreeing out loud." I drove home that night, updated my notebook with Renata's exact phrasing, word for word, and did not yet understand that I had just watched the opening move of a plan that had, by that point, already been quietly in motion for longer than any of us in that room besides Renata and Grant actually knew. There was one more small but telling incident that December, worth including because it foreshadowed the misdirected text that would eventually break everything open. Sophie, then 13, was helping me set up a new phone, transferring contacts and apps when she asked casually, "Mom, why aren't you in the Whitcomb fam group chat? I see it in Aunt Paige's phone when she's over." I told her I genuinely didn't know there was a group chat by that name, assuming she meant the old family thread I was already part of. She shook her head. "No, this one's newer, it has a different name." I remember the specific small chill of that moment, not alarm exactly, not yet, just the quiet registration of a detail that didn't fit the story I'd been telling myself about my place in this family. I didn't investigate it further that month. I simply added it, the way I'd added so much else, to the notebook, and to the growing, unexamined weight of things that didn't quite add up. I want to include one more scene from that Thanksgiving, because it's the clearest single moment I have of how normalized the imbalance had become by then. My father, carving the turkey, said to the table generally, "I'm a lucky man. 3 kids who all turned out fine, each in their own way." Grant raised his glass to that. Paige smiled. I remember smiling too, genuinely, because on its surface it was a kind, ordinary thing for a father to say at Thanksgiving. It was only driving home that night, Marcus beside me, Sophie asleep in the back seat, that I said, out loud for the first time, something that had been sitting in me for years without language. "I don't think he actually sees what it's cost me to be the one he never worries about." I think fine, in your own way, is the nicest possible way of saying the one I don't have to think about. Marcus didn't try to talk me out of the thought. He just reached over and held my hand the rest of the drive, which, that particular night, was exactly the right amount of response. By early 2024, 7 weeks before that April birthday dinner, I noticed something I couldn't quite name yet. Sitting in my father's kitchen one Sunday afternoon, reconciling his checking account as I did every month by then. A single line item, dated 6 weeks earlier, showed a $2,000 payment to Voss and Associates, my father's longtime estate attorney, described in the memo line only as consultation. I didn't think much of it at the time. My father met with Harlan Voss periodically about the trust, about the business succession plan for the stores, about a dozen ordinary things a man managing a 6-store family business needed a lawyer for. Year 9, early 2024. I want to describe the 7 weeks between that January discovery and the April birthday dinner in more detail because they matter more than I understood at the time. In February, my father asked me, unprompted, to accompany him to a routine meeting with Harlan Voss about the succession plan for the stores, a meeting I assumed, going in, would be purely operational. Renata came too, which struck me as slightly unusual since she'd rarely involved herself in the business side of things before. I remember sitting in Harlan's small conference room while he walked through the store succession structure, competent and thorough as always, and I remember Renata asking, almost offhandedly near the end, "Harlan, hypothetically, if Walter's health situation changed significantly, how would that affect anything currently in place?" Harlan, careful in the specific way good estate attorneys are careful, said only that any changes to legal capacity would be evaluated through a formal, documented process, and that nothing currently in place would be affected by informal family discussion alone. I remember thinking at the time that the question seemed like ordinary caution. I understand now that it was the first time I was present for one of Renata's actual reconnaissance missions, and that I simply hadn't yet developed the instinct to recognize it as one. That same February, Grant called me directly for the first time in months, not about business, but to ask carefully how I thought Dad was doing overall, cognitively. I told him the truth, that the mild cognitive impairment diagnosis from 2022 seemed stable, not worsening dramatically, based on what I was seeing week to week. He was quiet for a moment before saying, "That's good. That's really good to hear, Dana," in a tone that struck me even then as oddly deflated for someone supposedly relieved by good news. I didn't think much of it at the time. I filed it, the way I'd filed most things that decade, in the growing folder of details that didn't quite add up but weren't yet worth raising alone. In March, 3 weeks before the birthday dinner, I overheard, genuinely by accident, arriving early to pick up Sophie from a sleepover at Paige's house, a fragment of a phone conversation Paige was having in her kitchen, her voice carrying through the screen door. "I don't love how it's being handled either, but Renata says once there's paperwork, we're actually in a real position to talk to Dad about splitting things more fairly, not just hoping he brings it up himself." I knocked before I could hear more, and Paige, seeing me, ended the call quickly enough that I understood, even without the rest of the sentence, that I'd walked into the edge of something larger than a single conversation. I want you to hold onto that single line item, though, the way I eventually learned to hold onto it myself, because it's the first thread of the thing I wouldn't fully understand for another 4 months. The same 4 months that would take me from a folded piece of paper in my jacket pocket at a birthday dinner. Through a misdirected text message I was never supposed to see, to a conversation with an attorney's assistant that would tell me something about my own father's estate that nobody in my family, including me, had ever once expected to be true.